Okay, well, welcome back to the second segment of Healing the, let's see, the second segment of Ask John. No, this is another, anyway, we're continuing this show called Ask John, the second segment of Healing the Political Divide. Maybe the show is just going to be called Healing the Political Divide from now on. I just love this topic. It's so, it satisfies my frustration level. You know, in other words, if I really want to be totally frustrated, this is where I put my attention. We've been working on this thing called Healing the Political Divide, and it just seems like maybe it's impossible. We're trying to find people who on different sides of this great political divide, who actually want to understand the other side. Everyone's saying, yeah, I understand them. They're snowflakes. Or they're saying, you know, they're just a bunch of Trumpsters. They believe everything you said. Nobody cares. I mean, they do care. Everybody cares a lot. But does anybody really want to understand and talk across the divide? It seems to me. And what did you say? You said that if it wasn't impossible, I wouldn't be wanting to work on it?
That's right. I mean, why work on simple things, John? You and I, we just, it gets too boring. Let's tilt at these windmills.
Oh, let me reintroduce Richard Friesen, who has a master's in clinical psychology and has been working on this topic of healing the political divide for some time, and he's really skilled at helping people understand their own emotions and how that drives their decision making, and so his skills really come into this very, very, very much. And you have been talking about this thing, this widening partisan differences, and we'll show you this, and we'll have this up on the screen while you talk about it. What does this mean?
What this means is that we are all looking at our survival mechanisms. We all feel threatened to the core of our being. And as a result, we respond from the survival mechanisms, and that results in Thanksgivings and family reunions being broken up, you know, people not talking to each other, and the political divides.
How do we read this chart?
That chart is the amount of, that is the percentage point difference between the Republicans and Democrats over 48 values questions asked in the last 25 years.
Starting at 10.
Yeah, so
that's almost doubling.
It's almost doubling.
Well, actually, when we look at 1988, it was 9, and this is 2012,
so
it's 18.
We've got a doubling of the
and I suppose
differences
since
in value
2012,
questions.
it's even increased.
Oh yeah, it's significantly increased.
Yeah.
And the key there is it says the values. And I think that that's what is really upsetting to most people, is they feel that the core values that really mean a lot to them, that they're living their life from, are being threatened. And as a result, you know, as I mentioned, we drop down into our limbic system, our animal brain, and we operate from our survival mechanisms. And so they're so easily triggered now that you know, family units are sometimes in turmoil, or people in meetings are yelling and screaming at each other because we're dropped down into that survival mechanism.
Yeah. And just looking at something that I have in my notes here, that you said, the art of not knowing. The art of not knowing.
Well, that brings us now to the second part, and that as long as we all are absolutely 100% certain that we have the ultimate truth and that we are right, then of course the conversation doesn't go anywhere. So what I've done is I've added an extra layer for us to think about and to consider that might help that. You know, as we mentioned in the last segment, in my current model, in my current way of thinking, we have put the
I like the way you say your current model, because that means that you're willing to change, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. In fact, about 4 years ago.
Have you changed?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh,
I know you have.
Yeah. Well, I started out as a young American for freedom, a young Republican, Barry Goldwater, AU H2064. Then I went to college and I saw the poverty in the inner cities, the lousy education. I taught inner city school, and I went screaming to the other side of the spectrum. And I worked for a Saul Alinsky organizations, which is way on the progressive side up here. And so I started out on the conservative side. I went screaming to the progressive side, and then emotionally I read Ayn Rand and ended up on the libertarian side. And that has been, if I look at my own evolution, and now I'm looking at it from a different perspective. I have tasted each of these perspectives, and now I'm looking at them and realizing each of the values they bring to them, but I'm looking at them from a different point of view rather than absolute truth
and you talk about these positions are so laden with emotion, and emotion drives it more than anything. And then what you're telling me is to be effective, you've got to you have this schism. You have to bring yourself out of that emotion, and I keep trying to find that word that I never find. But there's a it doesn't matter. How can you be two things at once?
Right.
So you've got you
Yeah,
have this
the
emotion
dichotomy.
that you have this dichotomy, this emotion,
Right.
and yet you're saying in order to be effective, you've got to leave that behind. No, that's not what you're saying. You have to you rise above that in some way. How can you do that?
Okay, so what in my work I do, and I mentioned this last time, that if there's one word that describes what I do, it's rapport. And that's rapport with ourselves, rapport with the markets for my financial clients, and rapport with the environment, our friends, our family, and our community. So if we're building rapport and we're looking at ourselves and our emotional state, we can say, and typically I'm going to drive down these emotions. I'm going to ignore them. I'm going to quarantine them. I'm not going to deal with them. I'm not going to let so-and-so upset me again. I'm just not going to feel it. Well, in my experience as a coach and as a therapist, is that isn't very effective, because we just build up this pressure and eventually we explode at times that we later regret. So I take a different tack. Let's take these emotions, and what if we were to accept them? For example, at one point, I was an emotional conservative. At one point, I was an emotional progressive. At one point, I was an emotional libertarian. And in fact, if I look at myself, I probably say emotionally, I'm still over here. But if I say that is my emotional part, that freedom, that independence, that self-responsibility, that's what really gets my juices going. But I can also say, somebody who's on the conservative side, if they say, this is my emotional part of me, I really want to see a morality, a moral order. I want to see constitutionality. I want to see rules of the road that we can all obey. I want to take and even maybe legislate morality. And I can also see the emotional and really identify with the emotions of a progressive and say, we want social justice, we want fairness, we want equality. We look at slavery, the civil rights movement, the Industrial Revolution, where people were treated like cogs in a machine. There were really victims in this part up here. And if you step into this and your heart is here, why not just say, that's okay? What if we could just say that I'm okay in my emotional position? Now, like I mentioned earlier, when we were talking in the office, it's a bit of a trick. Because what I'm saying is, I'm asking you, in the language I'm using, to identify the emotional position that you have and say that it's okay. But in identifying it as emotional position and saying it's okay, that brings on a lot of freedom.
And you've talked about about recognizing the value of each emotional position, or every emotional position, because there must be a ton of different emotional positions.
Oh yeah,
because we're not very few of us are at these extremes that you're talking
right.
about.
Well, this is a very simplistic model, and of course, people are all over the place in this, and my definition of each of these positions is really simplistic also. So what you're pointing out, there's just a lot of complexity and a lot of emotional complexity in here too. But the value of looking at the world from this model is that we can start to appreciate not only our own emotional state, let's say I'm here, but we can appreciate the emotional state here and the emotional state here. For example, in my current model, is that
You talked about that each has value to the community. In other
Yes.
words. Yeah.
so, what I see, one of the most wonderful things about America is that we have this dynamic. And this dynamic has a contribution from each parts of this triangle. And if we look at the founding of America, more toward the libertarian side, if we look at times in our past where we've had largely a conservative, if we had times when the progressives stood up for the victims in the world, there have been times where we've moved, throughout this place. And the value is this dynamic tension. So imagine if we just had this up here. What would happen to, who would pay for it? Who would run the world? What would happen to our debt? Imagine if we just had this here. Would we have such a rigid structure so that people with different sexual orientations or different ways of lifestyle who want to live very independent lives, would they be constrained under this? Or if we look at this, and we look at the individualism, and we ignore the tribal nature and how our brains are built, and our need for social interactions and creating
Chaos.
yeah, if you go to the extreme,
Yeah.
are you going to build in chaos? So the dynamic between here, and as a nation, we shift where it's appropriate. And this is what makes America great, is the dynamic between all this.
Would you want to play this out just a little bit more and talk about the values of each one of the...
Sure. And, we can see that in the past there's been genuine victims. There's been victims in slavery. Huge victimization that was just so destructive to just being human. Whether either side of that equation, it is just destructive to our humanity. And the progressive movement came in, and they said, we're going to end slavery. You look at what Lincoln did. The Republicans actually were the progressives here, and they were the ones that were really moving here, and that was really important. Now, what happens, however, is that when we take this and take it to extreme, and the world moves up and is living in this extreme, well, then we have a problem because we've lost the dynamic. The conservatives, real value, if we look at the founding of our country, is that it was just assumed we were a God-fearing nation, that we had these 10 commandments, that we had these rules of moral order. And that's no longer the case for the most part. But what the conservatives can bring is that sense of moral order, of a long-term values, of moving slowly and changing slowly and allowing our country to adapt and grow in a way within, so we don't go off the rails. The libertarians, they bring a real value here, because if either of these groups want to start to control the government and take over the government and either create a whole social justice fairness system that is really repressive, or these guys want to create a moral order that's repressive, then the libertarians can say, hey, whoa, this is not what this country is about. And so as a country, and as a culture, we move in this, and the dynamic between those is so valuable. So recognizing our own emotional position, recognizing the value that it creates and the value it adds to our country, and then recognizing the value that each of these does also, I think is where we're starting now to look at how we can heal the political divide. Actually, John, we're not healing the political divide, we're healing ourselves. And as we heal ourselves with this and are able to rise up at a higher level, then we can listen to others, we can be with others, and we can spread that higher spiritual level where we can accept and love people and realize that they are there with positive intent and they are there contributing to our country.
Excellent. Well, let's see. What else do we want to talk about?
We can
compared
talk
to-
about how things go off the rails.
Well, how did things go off the rails?
That's a good question.
And when did they go off the rails? Have they always been off the rails?
Yes.
When were they on the rails? When was everything running smoothly?
Never.
When did we not have any problems?
Never.
When did we not have any divide?
Never.
Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, what about them?
Yeah, they.
Did they have their act together?
No, they were pretty vicious with each other.
Yeah. I don't know if this is true, but I heard this story about Adams being somebody threw a rock at him. Things were so people were so upset. Somebody and actually injured him, and then I'm not. Maybe I shouldn't spread rumors because I'm not 100% certain. I'm sure anyone can fact check this. Did both Adams and Jefferson die on the same day on July 4th? And whoever died second didn't know that the other one had already died, and his last words were, "Jefferson lives."
Oh.
I heard that story. It's one of those stories you kind of like to believe is true.
Sure. Sure. So we've always
But
had
the
this.
rancor just kept going on, and there were people took sides, and I'm assuming that the people kept those sides for years and years.
Yeah. So imagine
And we
what
had a
if.
civil war.
Yeah.
We had a civil war. And
We lost
Yeah.
500,000, over 500,000 men in the Civil
Yeah.
War.
Yeah.
And women, I guess.
Yeah. Are we having those feelings now? Certainly, we're not going to have a physical civil war. I hope. I hope we don't have a physical civil war.
Yeah.
But are we having a civil war with those kinds of emotions now?
Well, I think the emotions are pretty intense. And hopefully we're in the place that they don't move to physical violence. And I think part of that is if we can all appreciate that the contributions each of these positions makes, if we can all appreciate that the life of America is in the dynamic here. The life of America is not in any one of these positions, but is in the dynamic of these positions going around. And if you can now recognize we're in part of that dynamic, and that is just part of America, and you look to where we've come from, I mean, it is just totally amazing. When my wife was in high school, the counselor said, do you want to be a nurse? Do you want to be a secretary or a teacher? My daughter is working for NASA as a physicist, and she's working on the asteroid hitting the Earth problem. What a world of difference we've made.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just tremendous. And that world of difference is that dynamic between these. We need the wisdom of the past. We need the guardrails. We need the people who are looking out for the victims. We need the libertarians to make sure neither of these groups goes off the rails. You know, if the conservatives go off the rails, they want to pass morality laws, who we can marry, what drugs we can take. They want to legislate morality as they go off the rails. The progressives go off the rails if they want to legislate absolute fairness among us, and everything becomes political. What is fair? Who's the perpetrator? Who is the victim? The progressives go off the rails by creating victims, and if we don't have enough victims, we will find microaggressions. So we need a victimization up here in order to maintain the power. We need rules of morality in order to maintain the power. And these guys, of course, are a little left out.
Rich, what do you think our media is doing to generate this kind of emotion?
Well, what we're doing is we are triggering the core survival mechanisms of each of these. So each of these groups has a core survival mechanism. You know, it's moral order. The destruction of moral order here is the destruction of the world. I mean, it threatens me personally. If I am here, that if you listen to conservative news, it's about the breakdown of moral order. If you listen to more progressive news, it is about victim and perpetrator. If you listen to the libertarians, it's about a noose that is tightened around the neck of the individual and freedom. So what each of these media does.
Does the media have any incentive to bring people together? Let's think about
Let's
that.
think about that.
Let's think about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to be.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be.
Scott Adams talks about what their business model.
Yeah.
They talk about their business model. Their business model is to create this emotion so people stay
sure.
tuned in.
Sure.
It sells advertising, it sells
Sure.
product.
And I'll bet you, it used to be there was a more neutral news and everybody watched it, and that was kind of our core, that we had, difference of opinions, but we basically had similar news. But now, if you look at the news, you look at the conservative news, the progressive news, I mean, you can look at the same, I've done this, listen to the same event from both of them. You would not, if an alien came, they would never guess it was the same event. I mean, it's
Right.
just very different.
Yeah, yeah. We see that every day in the news. If we look for it, we don't really want to look for it, do we? I mean,
No, we don't.
I mean, how do you get news as fact? How do you get news as events rather than as presented in an emotional way, in an opinionated way?
Yeah. Well, do you ever listen? Occasionally, late night radio, I'll listen to KQED, and they'll have the BBC on.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. It's like, whoa, there's somebody just reporting the news.
Right.
And it's truly amazing.
Yeah. But what kind of listenership do they have?
Yeah.
Are they selling any advertisements? I mean, we don't tune into that stuff. Yeah,
it's true. Well,
Yeah, I found
one of the
I
things we
wish I
need to
remember the name of
recognize.
this website because I'd like to plug it, but I found this website that just presents news
Mhm.
and a discussion,
Mhm.
but they require civility, and
Oh,
it's
no.
amazing. It's amazing. It's really nice to hear people or to read people's opinions without it being charged.
Yeah. Well, it turns out the way our brains work is that we can't make decisions without our emotions. People whose emotional functioning of the brain has been destroyed through an accident, or when the neuroscientists temporarily freeze in parts of the brains that deal with emotions, people can't make a decision to pick up a red pen or a blue pen.
Yeah.
So I think that rather than trying to eliminate emotions, is to recognize them. And again, when we talked about the first segment, is to say, where is your emotional position here? And let's make that okay. Mine, was here originally. It went up here. Now it's here. And I can say, well, that's my emotional position. And that's okay. And once we recognize it as okay and recognize it as an emotional position, then we can ask somebody, say, hey, what's your emotional position? I'm really care about social justice and unfairness. I really care about the victims of this world who are taken advantage of by the perpetrators. What's your emotional state? I'm afraid of the breakdown of some sort of moral order. That once that breaks down, how do you ever put it back together again? So once we recognize these as emotional positions, we can then start to respect them because we're respecting our own. And that's the key, is respecting ourselves, respecting our emotional and intellectual positions, and not be afraid of them. What we talked about last time is I said, this is a model. This is my current way of thinking. It's just a model. It may help some people, it may not help others. But if I can look at myself and my position as my current model, then it really frees me. For example, when I was 18, what did I believe in? Do I believe the same things now? No. When I was 20, 25, 40, 50, 60. Stop. Do I believe the same things? No, I've had some major revolutions. So what makes me think at this moment in my life that I have the capital T truth?
Yeah.
Why would I want to think that?
Yeah.
I mean, my environment,
That
the news.
stops your growth as soon as you totally
Yeah.
accept that you have all of the capital T truth, as you put it, that your growth stops.
Right.
So that's the thing that I think most about as we're talking, and you're talking about. It is just natural, normal human behavior to operate on our emotion, and so what you're asking is something that's extraordinary.
Yes.
Asking to not to give that up because we know we can't give that up, but to try to find a way to rise above that and recognize it from slightly higher ground.
What you've just done, John, is put your finger on the windmill, the tilting, the
Yeah.
windmill.
just a little push, and we're just out of time
Already?
Already.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe it.
Yeah. So we're gonna have a lot more fun. Fun is coming our way.
Okay.
Is this fun? Are we having fun yet?
I'm having fun.
Oh, good. Okay, so we're gonna work on healing on our next segment.
Healing.
And we're gonna learn how each position creates positive, dynamic. How did you say that? A positive, dynamic, and extreme. Wait a minute. Each position creates positive. Why did I wrote that down? So you're gonna read that.
Well, I'm going to read that.
Well, you're not going to read that, but I wrote in shorthand your notes. This is what
Yeah,
we're going
we
to say
talked
at the end
about
of the
the
show.
bit
Hey,
that-
we're making this show as we go along. Don't worry about it. It's going to
Yeah.
be fine.
Okay.
Well,
So we talked a bit about that
excuse us.
today. It's about the positive is the dynamic between these two.
Yeah, and you're talking about the extreme and,
And-
how that damages.
Right, and
Yeah,
we can
so-
talk a bit about
yeah.
how every one of these goes off the rails.
Yeah.
But mostly next time, I really want to talk about the real challenge, and that's healing. And the secret is, we're not going to heal the political divide out there. We're going to heal ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's where the value lies.
Okay. So you get to tune in and watch. You're going to watch me heal myself. We're going to watch us heal ourselves, and that's where the value lies.
That's where it is.
Lies. Thank you, Rich. I really appreciate you coming here. You drove quite a long way to get here today, and got caught in a bridge accident,
Yep.
traffic thing. And anyway, I do appreciate it, and this is very informative, and it's kind of fun.
It is.
Somehow I'm drawn to it, and you are too. So
I am.
we will be back another day, and we will get more into this healing process.
Let's get into the healing process.
Okay. Thanks for joining us, and please tune in again. Take care.
Bye-bye.